Northern Germany, April 1945. From the ruins of a shattered town, a senior Wehrmacht officer steps forward to surrender. His tailored tunic is immaculate. By the old rules of European warfare, he expects to formally present his sidearm to a British officer of equal rank, preserving his honor in defeat. But the men waiting for him aren't interested in Prussian tradition. A grimy, battle-hardened British corporal steps up, levels a Sten submachine gun directly at the commander's chest, and barks a single order: drop the weapon immediately. In a fraction of a second, what was supposed to be a formal capitulation turns into a deadly standoff. This standoff was not an isolated incident. Across the European theater in the final months of the war, a volatile culture clash was playing out on the front lines. On one side stood the aristocratic Prussian military tradition. For generations, German officers were indoctrinated to believe that their rank and status elevated them above the grim realities of defeat. They expected the privileges of their class, anticipating a formal, dignified capitulation where sidearms were handed over to Allied commanders of equal standing as a sign of mutual professional respect. On the other side stood the exhausted, brutal reality of the British infantry. These men had fought their way through the bocage of Normandy, the freezing mud of the winter campaigns, and the Rhine crossings. To a battle-hardened Tommy, a German officer demanding protocol was not a gentleman deserving of deference. He was simply a defeated enemy who was still holding a loaded weapon. We are going to investigate this psychological minefield of surrender when the rigid pride of the Wehrmacht collided with Allied soldiers who had absolutely zero tolerance for ceremonial posturing. The transition from combat to captivity became incredibly dangerous. How did the basic act of laying down arms devolve into a volatile confrontation where a misplaced sense of honor could instantly get a man killed in the final days of the war? To understand why these surrenders became so perilous, we have to look at the sheer scale of the psychological disconnect that had developed by late 1944. The romanticized codes of 19th-century European warfare, where generals negotiated armistices in velvet-draped tents and defeated commanders were treated as esteemed guests, had long been obliterated by industrialized slaughter. The concept of chivalrous combat between noble peers had died in the mud of the First World War and was permanently buried under the carpet bombing and mechanized annihilation of the Second. Yet, against all evidence to the contrary, a significant portion of the German officer corps remained stubbornly anchored to an archaic illusion of military nobility. This illusion was not an accident. It was the product of deep institutional conditioning. For generations, the Prussian military model had cultivated an officer class that viewed itself as a distinct aristocracy, separate from the civilian population and inherently superior to the enlisted men they commanded. Within this rigid hierarchy, an officer's status was paramount, and it was visually cemented by his uniform and, most importantly, his personal sidearm. Whether it was the iconic Luger P-08 or the standard-issue Walther P-38, the pistol was far more than a tool for close-quarters defense. It was the physical manifestation of authority, a symbol of the officer's commission, and an extension of his personal honor. In their doctrine, yielding that weapon was a profound act of submission that could only be offered to an adversary of equivalent rank. To hand a loaded pistol to an enemy private or corporal was considered a deep humiliation, a violation of the unspoken fraternity of military professionals. They believed that even in absolute defeat, their rank afforded them a buffer of privilege. The British Army advancing through northwestern Europe in the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945 held an entirely different perspective. This was not a professional army of career soldiers adhering to Victorian social protocols. It was largely a conscript army, composed of former factory workers, clerks, and laborers who had been dragged away from their civilian lives to dismantle the Third Reich. By the time they breached the Siegfried Line and pushed into Germany proper, these men had endured the meat grinder of Normandy, the grueling logistical nightmares of the autumn campaign, and the freezing misery of the Ardennes. The British infantryman was exhausted, cold, and intimately familiar with the sudden, violent nature of death. His worldview had shrunk to the basic mechanics of survival and the grim necessity of eliminating threats. When a British platoon encountered a German command post trying to surrender, the enlisted men and non-commissioned officers were not calculating the social standing of the men emerging from the bunkers. They saw the enemy through a purely pragmatic lens. A German colonel attempting to retain his holster while demanding to see a British brigade commander was not viewed as a man preserving his dignity. He was viewed as a highly trained, hostile combatant who was still holding a loaded firearm. The British infantry had lost too many friends to booby traps, feigned surrenders, and desperate last-stand ambushes to entertain any theatrical demands. For a 19-year-old Tommy, gripping a Lee-Enfield rifle, patience was non-existent. The only acceptable condition for an enemy soldier, regardless of whether he wore the insignia of a private or a major general, was completely empty-handed with his arms raised. This pragmatic approach was actually entirely consistent with international law, a fact that directly contradicted the German officers' expectations. The 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, which both Germany and the United Kingdom had ratified, established the fundamental rules for these encounters. The treaty was meticulously designed to ensure the humane treatment of captured soldiers. Article 2 explicitly stated that prisoners of war must at all times be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. It guaranteed that captives would not be subjected to reprisals or physical abuse. However, the convention did not accommodate 19th-century posturing. Article 6 dictated that all personal effects and articles for personal use would remain in the possession of prisoners of war, but it made a massive, explicit exception for arms, horses, and military equipment. The legal mandate was absolute, total disarmament at the point of capture. There was no clause in the Geneva Convention that allowed commissioned officers to retain their sidearms for the sake of ceremony, nor did it grant them the right to dictate to whom they would surrender. The moment a combatant declared their intention to yield, they were legally required to instantly relinquish any capacity to inflict harm. The laws of war recognized that the transition from active combat to captivity is the most volatile phase of any engagement, and immediate, total disarmament is the only way to diffuse that volatility. The British frontline troops, while likely unfamiliar with the specific numerical articles of the 1929 Convention, instinctively enforced its core directive. They were executing the standard operating procedure of a modern, industrialized military: neutralize the threat, secure the prisoners, and move the line forward. The stage was perfectly set for a catastrophic misunderstanding. You had a defeated elite desperately clinging to a defunct social order, attempting to stage manage their own downfall, colliding head-on with a mechanized, ruthless Allied war machine that viewed them simply as neutralized assets. On one side, a deep-seated ideological need to maintain superiority, on the other, an absolute refusal to grant it. It was a profound ideological disconnect between two entirely different concepts of how war should be conducted and concluded. But knowing the rules on paper and understanding the vast cultural divide separating the captor and the captive was entirely different from enforcing them in the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled ruins of a collapsed front line. The abstract tension over international law and cultural expectations evaporated the second these two forces physically collided. The friction typically peaked at the exact moment of capture, transforming what should have been a straightforward logistical handover into a deadly confrontation. Consider a documented scenario playing out across the German border in early 1945. A British infantry section, covered in the dirt of a 3-day advance, breaches a reinforced cellar serving as a local Wehrmacht command post. A German colonel, realizing his position is hopeless, steps out from the shadows. His uniform is remarkably clean compared to the men pointing Lee-Enfield rifles at his chest. He declares his surrender in heavily accented English, but his hands are not raised. Instead, his right hand rests deliberately near the heavy leather flap of his holster, where his 9mm Luger is secured. The British sergeant, a man who has likely seen half his original platoon killed or wounded since Normandy, gives a clear, unambiguous command to disarm. The German colonel refuses. He shakes his head, stands rigid, and demands to be taken immediately to a British officer of equal rank. insisting that he will only hand over his sidearm to a gentleman. For the German commander, this is a calculated display of aristocratic dignity. He is attempting to control the narrative of his defeat, using protocol as a shield to preserve his status. But for the British sergeant and his men, this demand is not just insulting, it is a direct, immediate threat to their lives. The British troops are operating under the relentless pressure of combat fatigue. They know that German forces frequently employed tactical deceptions, including feigned surrenders that ended in sudden machine gun fire. A man refusing to drop his weapon is not a captive, he is an active combatant. The psychological disconnect instantly becomes a tactical crisis. The British response is universally aggressive. The sergeant does not pause to debate the nuances of Prussian honor or the Geneva Convention. He simply chambers around, aiming the barrel directly at the colonel's face. While the rest of the section tightens their grip on their Sten guns, the threat of immediate execution hangs heavily in the cramped, dusty air of the cellar. In that fraction of a second, the German officer's demand for privilege is completely shattered. He is forced into the cold, terrifying realization that his rank, his tailored uniform, and his aristocratic lineage mean absolutely nothing to these exhausted men. They do not see a noble peer. They see the enemy commander responsible for the artillery fire that killed their friends just hours before. The illusion of military nobility collapses under the raw, mechanical reality of a leveled firearm. He slowly unbuckles the holster and lets the heavy pistol fall to the stone floor. This localized friction, a few men shouting over a piece of ceremonial metal in a ruined basement, was not an isolated event. It was happening constantly. And as the Allied armies pushed deeper into the crumbling Reich, this friction quickly escalated into a widespread crisis as mass surrenders began to overwhelm the entire Western Front. As the spring of 1945 thawed the frozen European landscape, the localized friction of individual surrenders began multiplying on a truly staggering scale. The collapse of the Wehrmacht was no longer happening unit by shattered unit. It was happening by entire army groups. Following the massive Allied crossing of the Rhine and the subsequent suffocating encirclement of the Ruhr pocket, British and Canadian forces found themselves drowning in a human tidal wave of capitulation. In the span of just a few weeks, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were marching westward, clogging the ruined roads and cratered highways, desperately seeking to surrender to the Western Allies rather than face the advancing Soviet forces in the east. For the logistics officers and military police of the British 21st Army Group, this unprecedented influx was an administrative and tactical nightmare. They were suddenly tasked with disarming, feeding, guarding, and transporting a hostile population the size of a major industrial city, all while desperately trying to maintain the forward logistical momentum of their own combat divisions pushing toward the Baltic. Into this chaotic, deeply strained logistical environment walked the remnants of the German officer corps. Even as their nation was being pounded into ash and rubble behind them, a significant percentage of these commanders arrived at Allied checkpoints fully expecting the administrative machinery of the British Army to pause and accommodate their elevated social standing. Generals, colonels, and majors drove up to temporary barbed wire holding pens, hastily erected enclosures, colloquially known as POW cages, often just open, muddy fields ringed with concertina wire, and immediately began attempting to dictate the terms of their own captivity. Stepping out of surviving Mercedes and Horch staff cars, they demanded specialized transport, vehemently insisting that it was a violation of military decorum for field-grade officers to be marched on foot alongside common infantrymen. They requested designated trucks, separate billets away from the enlisted men, and specific, superior rations. Furthermore, they fully expected to retain their personal staffs, the drivers, adjutants, and enlisted orderlies whose sole military function was to cater to the commander's daily administrative and personal needs. To the German elite, these were not outrageous or arrogant requests. They were simply the standard operating procedures of a civilized military establishment, the absolute minimum baseline of professional courtesy they believed they were owed, even in total defeat. But the British field units receiving these demands were in absolutely no mood to extend professional courtesy. The frontline infantry battalions managing these massive, overwhelming intake points were operating on zero sleep, stretched supply lines, and severely frayed nerves. When a freshly captured German battalion commander began issuing sharp complaints about the lack of dedicated officer transport to a British corporal who had spent the last 3 weeks sleeping in waterlogged trenches and dodging artillery fire, the reaction was swift, physical, and utterly devoid of diplomatic grace. The British infantrymen responded to these demands with an aggressive, systematic, and highly invasive stripping of the German officers' authority. The disarmament process, which the German officers had romantically anticipated as a formal, dignified handover of their sidearms, instead became a rapid, ruthlessly efficient shakedown. British troops ordered the officers to stand in the freezing mud, heavily guarded at gunpoint, while they were aggressively patted down and searched. The British did not just take the iconic Luger P-08s and Walther P-38 pistols. They methodically stripped the officers of virtually every physical tool that signified their command and status. Carl Zeiss field binoculars, expensive Leica cameras, finely crafted leather map cases, navigational compasses, and signal flares were all ruthlessly confiscated and thrown into growing piles of captured equipment. From the perspective of the British command and international law, these were entirely legitimate seizures of military materiel. A compass or a map is a vital escape aid. Binoculars are tactical observation tools that cannot be left in the hands of a prisoner. But to the proud, status-obsessed Prussian officer, having his neck rapidly cleared of his expensive optics by a grim-faced, swearing 19-year-old private from Liverpool or Manchester felt exactly like being mugged in a back alley. This aggressive processing frequently crossed the line from strict tactical disarmament into deliberate psychological leveling. While strictly against official army regulations, it was not uncommon for battle-hardened British troops to strip German officers of their ornate ceremonial daggers and occasionally high-level combat decorations like the Iron Cross or the Knight's Cross. To the British infantry, these items were either highly valuable souvenirs of a brutal, hard-won war or simply the detested symbols of a fascist regime they had spent years trying to destroy. To the German officer, however, the forced removal of a combat medal was a profound, almost physical desecration of his personal honor and military record. Yet, if the officer dared to protest, if he raised his voice or attempted to pull away, he was met not with a sympathetic ear or an apology, but with the cold, heavy steel muzzle of a Sten submachine gun shoved violently into his ribs. The message delivered by the enlisted men was unmistakable and final. You are no longer a commander of anything. You are simply a number in a cage, and you will do exactly as you are told. To understand why the German officers were so deeply shocked by this abrasive treatment and why they continually risked their lives to stubbornly protest it at the checkpoints, one must look at the psychological environment they had inhabited for the previous 12 years. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, had spent over a decade meticulously crafting and reinforcing a very specific, deeply derogatory image of the British military. In the German domestic narrative, the British were never portrayed as a formidable, disciplined, or dedicated martial culture. Instead, they were relentlessly characterized as a decaying, cowardly empire of wealthy plutocrats who fought their wars by proxy, using exploited colonial troops, machines, and an uncultured, working-class rabble who lacked any true fighting spirit. Through endless radio broadcasts, cinematic newsreels, and relentless military indoctrination, the Wehrmacht officer was taught that the British soldier was fundamentally inferior in discipline, tactical acumen, and military ethos. The British were depicted as mere mercenaries fighting for financial interests, entirely lacking the ideological purity, deep historical roots, and noble martial tradition of the German soldier. Consequently, when German officers were finally forced by overwhelming strategic reality to surrender to these men, they did not view their captors as professional equals. They viewed them through a lens heavily distorted by years of state-sponsored propaganda. They genuinely believed that they were surrendering to an undisciplined, uncultured, and disorganized force that practically required a firm, authoritative German hand to show them how proper, civilized military administration should be conducted. This deeply ingrained prejudice, this absolute certainty of their own inherent superiority, created a fatal psychological blind spot at the exact moment of their deepest vulnerability. This propaganda-fueled worldview made the German officers incredibly, dangerously arrogant during the initial, highly volatile moments of their capture. They frequently approached British checkpoints not as defeated, neutralized prisoners, but almost as visiting military inspectors arriving to review the troops. Eyewitness accounts and regimental war diaries from the spring of 1945 repeatedly describe captured Wehrmacht colonels and majors attempting to actively pull rank on British enlisted sentries. They would stride up to a checkpoint and bark orders in German, expecting the same immediate, unquestioning compliance they received from their own men. When ordered by a British corporal to empty their pockets and drop their gear, they would indignantly refuse, crossing their arms and demanding to speak to the camp commandant or a British officer of at least field-grade rank. When told to sit on the muddy ground with the rest of the exhausted prisoners waiting to be processed, they would remain rigidly standing, adopting a posture of outraged defiance and offended dignity. This behavior represented a massive, nearly suicidal underestimation of the men holding the weapons. The German officers fatally mistook the British troops' lack of parade ground formality for a lack of lethal resolve. Because the British sentries often looked thoroughly scruffy, wore non-matching, mud-caked winter gear, and spoke with heavy, working-class regional accents rather than the clipped, polished tones of an aristocratic elite, the German commanders assumed they could easily intimidate them. They completely failed to realize that beneath the grime, the casual posture, and the apparent lack of strict protocol was a brutally efficient, battle-hardened killing machine. The British infantry had spent nearly a year fighting their way through some of the most concentrated, lethal, and fanatic defensive positions in the history of mechanized warfare. They were not undisciplined amateurs. They were highly competent veterans who were simply entirely focused on functional survival and the grim mechanics of victory. They had absolutely zero patience left for the theatrical, aristocratic performances of a defeated enemy who was actively delaying the processing line. The collision of this arrogant, propaganda-induced posturing with the raw, uncompromising reality of the British front line inevitably triggered a rapid, terrifying psychological collapse for the German elite. The breaking point usually occurred when a German officer, blinded by his own sense of status, pushed his luck just a fraction of an inch too far, perhaps taking an aggressive step toward a British guard, suddenly reaching toward his uniform jacket to retrieve a document, raising his voice to issue a harsh command, or flatly refusing a direct order to unbuckle his holster. The British response to this insubordination was never a verbal debate regarding the articles of the Geneva Convention. It was instantly, aggressively kinetic. A sharp, punishing blow from the brass-bound butt of a Lee Enfield rifle to the back of the knees, a heavy, hobnailed boot violently kicking their legs out from under them, or simply being physically seized by the tunic and thrown face first into the freezing mud alongside the enlisted men. In a single, violent instant, the protective psychological bubble of rank, tradition, and state propaganda was completely shattered. Sitting in the cold mud, their tailored Feldgrau uniforms ruined, surrounded by the towering barbed wire of a temporary holding pen, and staring up at the impassive, exhausted, and utterly unsympathetic faces of their captors, the officers' arrogance dissolved into genuine, suffocating anxiety. The German commanders suddenly, vividly realized that the international laws of war, their expensive uniforms, and their prestigious military lineage provided absolutely no physical armor against a high-velocity bullet. They recognized with crystal clarity that the grimy men guarding them would not hesitate for a microsecond to pull the trigger if they perceived even the slightest threat or attempt at resistance. The realization was profound and deeply destabilizing. They were now completely, helplessly at the mercy of men who harbored a deep, visceral, and historically justified hatred for everything the German uniform represented. The aristocratic swagger instantly vanished, replaced by the rigid, silent terror of a man who suddenly understands that his continued existence hangs entirely on the frayed, razor-thin patience of an exhausted enemy. As these tense, localized standoffs multiplied across the theater, fueled by the sheer volume of prisoners flooding into the Allied lines, the situation at the forward collection points threatened to spiral completely out of control. The British troops guarding the prisoners were severely traumatized by the bitter, freezing winter campaigns, the endless artillery barrages, and the brutal, close-quarters urban fighting of the preceding months. Almost every man in those rifle companies had lost close friends to German snipers, hidden mines, and fanatical last-stand defenses. Seeing a German officer, the very architects of that misery, acting with brazen entitlement and stubbornly refusing to comply with basic disarmament orders was a profound, intolerable provocation. The urge to simply pull the trigger, to end the argument permanently, and avenge their fallen comrades in the mud of the POW cage was incredibly strong. The atmosphere around the checkpoints became heavily charged, crackling with the very real, immediate threat of summary execution. Recognizing that their own weary, trigger-happy men were often mere seconds away from opening fire out of pure, unadulterated frustration, British junior officers, the 22-year-old lieutenants and 25-year-old captains carrying the immense weight of frontline command, were forced to aggressively intervene. They did not step into these confrontations out of any deep sympathy for the German commanders' bruised egos or a desire to uphold 19th-century chivalry. They stepped in to maintain the vital fire discipline of their own units, to prevent the logistical disaster of a riot in the cages, and to stop their men from committing a mass shooting that would cross the line into a war crime. A British captain would frequently have to sprint across the mud and physically push his own furious, white-knuckled sergeants back, interposing his own body between the leveled rifles of his men and the defiant, uncooperative German officer. To immediately diffuse the explosive tension and reassert absolute control, the British officers adopted a strategy of overwhelming, uncompromising dominance. Rather than politely allowing the German commander to formally and honorably hand over his weapon, the British officer would step forward and forcibly, aggressively disarm the prisoner himself. He would physically rip the sidearm from the German's leather holster, tear the binoculars violently from around his neck, and loudly, aggressively order the shocked commander to get moving into the holding pen. It was a calculated, highly visible display of harsh authority. By physically manhandling the high-ranking German officer and systematically stripping him of his dignity in plain sight of the enlisted men, the British lieutenant satisfied his own troops' demand for justice and absolute dominance, while simultaneously preventing them from committing murder. The British junior officer became the blunt, uncompromising instrument of compliance, forcefully breaking the German commander's pride in order to save the German commander's life, and to keep his own exhausted men from crossing a moral line they could not uncross. To the German military elite, standing shivering in the mud without their weapons, their optics, or their cherished honor, this treatment was interpreted as an act of barbaric, calculated humiliation. But for the British infantry, this brutal, zero-tolerance efficiency was born from a very dark, practical lesson. That refusal to indulge aristocratic fantasies was not driven by class resentment or a desire for petty revenge. It was a strictly enforced tactical mandate, starting in the claustrophobic hedgerows of Normandy and continuing through the grueling winter campaigns. Allied intelligence and frontline infantry battalions had documented a lethal pattern of enemy behavior. Hardline Waffen-SS units and fanatical Wehrmacht elements had repeatedly weaponized the very act of surrender. A white flag, or raised hands, often served as a fatal decoy, deliberately used to draw cautious British troops into the open before a concealed machine gun nest opened fire, or to buy just enough time to trigger hidden explosives. When a German commander stood at a checkpoint demanding a formal parley, stubbornly resting his hand near a loaded pistol holster to preserve his honor, the British did not see a proud gentleman. They saw a potentially lethal tactical delay. In the unpredictable, highly charged environment of a collapsing front, hesitation was a death sentence. Every second spent arguing over 19th century protocol was a second that an unseen sniper could use to acquire a target, or a retreating artillery battery could use to calculate a firing solution on a clustered, static group of soldiers. Furthermore, the sheer speed of the Allied advance transformed individual stubbornness into a severe strategic hazard. By April 1945, British armored columns were frequently operating at maximum velocity, driving deep through chaotic, unsecured territory, processing tens of thousands of incoming prisoners while maintaining forward momentum was already a logistical nightmare. Any administrative delay caused by a German officer's wounded pride created a dangerous bottleneck, stalling vulnerable convoys on narrow roads and directly threatening the security of the entire vanguard. The zero-tolerance policy was the only viable mathematical solution to keep the columns moving and the soldiers alive. A surrendered enemy had to be instantly neutralized, stripped of all agency, and rapidly moved to the rear without a single word of negotiation. But this localized, abrasive system of stripping authority was about to face its ultimate stress test. It was one thing to forcefully disarm a defiant field colonel. It was an entirely different matter when this uncompromising British protocol collided directly with the highest-ranking architects of the German war machine. In the first days of May 1945, as the Third Reich finally disintegrated, the highest echelons of the Wehrmacht approached the British lines to formally capitulate. They arrived at forward command posts in surviving Mercedes-Benz staff cars, stepping into the spring mud wearing immaculate greatcoats, perfectly polished jackboots, and the heavy ceremonial daggers of their rank. Even at this terminal stage, standing on the ashes of a destroyed nation, these corps commanders and field generals fully expected to be ushered into a private tent. They anticipated a formal exchange of credentials, a negotiated parley, and the traditional right to retain their personal sidearms as a recognized symbol of an unbroken martial spirit. But the British command structure had explicitly prepared for this final theatrical display. Across General Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, strict directives governed the treatment of high-ranking prisoners. There would be no military salutes. There would be no gentlemanly negotiations, and absolutely no German officer, regardless of the oak leaves on his collar or the Knight's Cross at his throat, would be permitted to keep a weapon. When the German general stepped forward to announce his surrender, expecting a British brigadier to step up and formally receive his pistol, he was instead met by a wall of hardened, unsmiling infantrymen. British commanding officers remained deliberately distant, refusing to participate in the expected peer-to-peer ritual. Instead, they coldly instructed their enlisted guards to process the enemy high command exactly like any other captured combatant. The psychological shock of this protocol was absolute. A decorated General der Infanterie, a man who had commanded entire army groups and held the power of life and death over tens of thousands, was suddenly blocked by a 20-year-old British private holding a Lee Enfield rifle. When the general instinctively hesitated, stiffening his posture, refusing to unbuckle his ceremonial belt, and demanding to speak with the commanding officer, the British guards did not yield an inch. Under the silent, icy approval of their own commanders, the front-line troops physically closed the distance. They did not politely ask for the surrender of the weapon. They reached out, grabbed the leather webbing, and forcefully stripped the general of his Walther pistol and his ornate dagger. The heavy steel and polished leather were unceremoniously tossed into a growing pile of captured ordnance in the dirt. In that singular, jarring action, the mythos of the invincible Prussian military aristocracy was finally and totally extinguished. The German high command was stripped not just of their physical weapons, but of the deep-seated illusion that they belonged to an untouchable elite caste above the consequences of the war they had waged. Standing entirely disarmed and powerless, flanked by exhausted, dust-covered Allied conscripts who viewed them merely as defeated men, the generals were forced to face the absolute totality of their ruin. The standoff ended not with a dignified exchange of swords, but with a harsh, unceremonious reality check. Back in that shattered town in northern Germany in April 1945, the tense standoff between the immaculate Wehrmacht commander and the grimy British corporal did not end with a negotiated compromise. Staring down the barrel of a leveled Sten submachine gun, the German officer finally recognized that the 19th century rulebook he was desperately clinging to had already burned to ash. No British brigadier was coming to offer him a salute. No gentlemanly parley was going to save his pride. With his psychological armor completely pierced by the terrifying, cold-blooded pragmatism of a working-class conscript, the commander slowly unbuckled his holster. He pulled out his polished Luger and dropped it unceremoniously onto a growing, tangled pile of captured Mauser rifles in the dirt. That heavy metallic clatter marked much more than the disarmament of a single officer. It signaled a permanent, irreversible shift in the mechanics of modern warfare. By absolutely refusing to indulge the aristocratic fantasies of the German officer class, the Allied frontline troops finalized the ideological defeat of the Prussian military mythos. The Second World War had been a conflict defined by mass production, mechanized slaughter, and entire populations mobilized for total annihilation. It was ultimately won not by titled nobility executing elegant battlefield maneuvers, but by millions of ordinary, exhausted men grinding their way through mud, freezing rain, and relentless artillery fire. The abrasive encounters at those frontline checkpoints proved a harsh, undeniable truth. In the era of industrialized conflict, archaic military elitism simply could not survive the uncompromising, democratic reality of the frontline infantryman. When that German pistol hit the dirt, stripped of all its ceremonial meaning and treated as just another piece of dangerous scrap metal, it represented the definitive, unglamorous end to an entire era of warfare. The old aristocratic doctrine had promised these commanding officers that their social prestige would outlast their shattered armies, guaranteeing a civilized, dignified exit from an otherwise barbaric, mechanized war. However, that deeply entrenched illusion of nobility was buried forever under the chaotic rubble of the collapsing Third Reich. The rigid Prussian tradition demanded that an officer's honor be meticulously preserved, even in total defeat, but the exhausted British infantrymen ultimately ensured that raw survival, not hollow ceremony, would dictate the absolute final terms.